This ain't no joke, this ain't no game. This that CSC game. They said pull up, so I came. You better put some respect on their name. Yeah, 55 was goody. Kill the vibe, how could he? Big card on the hoodie. Let me break it down for you fully. This ain't your average broadcast. This ain't just no podcast. The mother shows spread fake news. We just call them broadcast. West, Joey, Sam, Sean, Dr. And you know that boy Higgy. He said he don't want no small fries. Tell them they better make them biggie. Yeah, you already know what we be on. We got the crown, we hold the throne. We throw them L's and you take them home. When they ring the bells, you know that it's home. The bar set, we setting the tone. If we set it, then set it in stone. Sit in the seat, set up your phone. You in the car, no sports zone.
And welcome in to this week's episode of Around the ACC with DP, part of the Cardinal Sports Zone Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Dalton Pence. For those that weren't able to join us during the pilot episode of the show last week, just a reminder that this is a new show on the CSC Podcast Network that won't just always be me talking. There will be some more guests. Had some programming issues this week. I'm actually out of town through the duration of the week, so we had to kind of make ends meet, to say. But overall, it is what it is. Just a reminder that this is a show that doesn't focus more so on game-by-game analysis, but more of a broader overview of the ACC, of the implications around the conference, the national implications, and much, much more. Now, a lot of this is going to be football talk to start the season, but it's not always going to be football. We'll talk about basketball, volleyball, all Cardinals sports. The first episode talked about what was at stake with a Georgia Tech win or a loss this weekend. Thankfully, we will get to discuss the former. Now, I mentioned that win against Georgia Tech by itself wasn't going to be wasn't going to be all that significant, because, I mean, let's face it, guys, this was a win that Louisville was going to be asked to have. Like, you had to have this win. You were favored by over 8.5 points when this line finally closed, but ultimately you got the win. The main thing is that you pushed another possible ACC contender to the brink of contention. You gave Georgia Tech their second loss. And that's key, because you look at the rest of their schedule, they still have to play Miami. But you all know I'm a little bit more higher on Georgia Tech than a lot of Louisville fans are. I think that Tech is a good team. They brought back a lot of that starting offense from last season that was really good. They had a couple bad games last year. Defensively was where the main concern lied. Like, how good of a team defensively would Georgia Tech be? Ultimately, Louisville felt like they could have put up more than 31 points. Officiating was really not all that good. So it just sort of is what it is. But what you did gain was you're 1-0 in conference play. That is significant in its own right. Being able to win a conference game, you put yourself closer than you were to getting back to Charlotte, right? You also gave Georgia Tech their second loss. And like I said, I don't think a team with 3 ACC losses is going to get to the conference championship game. Georgia Tech would have to run the table to just remain with 2 conference losses. They lost to Syracuse earlier in the season, right? If they were to run the table and stay with 2 conference losses, if you make the point that Louisville also has 2, well, then the Cardinals hold the tiebreaker. You see how significant that is to hold that tiebreaker is, you don't have to worry about, well, what's Georgia Tech doing this week? Unless the Louisville goes on a skid and they lose more than 2 conference games. At that point, you're probably not making it to the ACC championship game. Nonetheless, I digress. So the Georgia Tech game was significant, but it was more so because of the conference implications that it could have down the road. Anytime you put a possible contender on the ropes to where they are likely no longer in contention, or at the very worst, the margin of error is not there, then you're in a really, really good spot. So that was the main thing for me, even though Louisville was favored in this contest. Coming up, Louisville has the game against Notre Dame, 3:30 kickoff on the road, first true road game, first game against a ranked opponent this season. Number 15 Louisville, number 16 Notre Dame will clash 3:30 on the Peacock Network. Unfortunately, this is the one game where Louisville is featured on Peacock, but no point in crying about it now. It just is what it is. So it's pretty interesting because the Notre Dame game doesn't have any conference implications. They're still an independent team. But like I said, this show isn't just featured on conference implications, but also the national landscape. So what Louisville could gain with a win over Notre Dame is you're able to boost that college football playoff resume. Notre Dame's rest of their schedule, put it this way, they don't have a road game. They don't have one road game for the rest of the year. That's wild to me. Not one road game. And USC, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase. They have one road game. That's all they have. It's the last game of the year against USC. Every single game on their schedule is winnable. Like Louisville and USC are the two toughest teams that Notre Dame plays. So let's say you give Notre Dame their second loss. There's a very good chance that they end the season 10-2 or 9-3. At that point, the win on your schedule from on the road in Notre Dame looks fantastic. And I know that Notre Dame usually is overrated coming into the season, but that name still holds weight. So the win is by default more significant, especially if you win this game on the road. So a ranked win on the road is a great opportunity to boost that college football resume and also just to continue to prove yourself across the national landscape, right? Like the verdict is still out according to the rest of the country on how good of a team Louisville can be. So one way you sort of alleviate those concerns is you come out on Saturday and you beat Notre Dame. So with a win over the Fighting Irish, you put yourself in a really good position. I mean, not only that, you're 4-0. So the longer you spend undefeated, by math, the better your chances are of getting to the college football playoff. Now, with a loss, you flip this on its head, right? With a loss, things get pretty interesting. It doesn't hurt you in conference play. Like a loss to Georgia Tech hurts more than a loss to Notre Dame because you were supposed to beat Georgia Tech. Notre Dame, you're still going to come into this game as an underdog, right? A loss to Notre Dame just doesn't help your college football playoff resume. It eliminates, or I should say, decreases the margin for error. Like you don't have a ton of opportunity to lose games. Like I don't think a team that, put it this way, if Louisville loses more than 10, or if Louisville loses more than 2 games, they're not going to make the college football playoff unless they win the ACC championship game. So it doesn't have any conference implications, but in terms of national landscape, college football playoff resume, this is where this game is going to take effect. So ultimately, Notre Dame, there's a lot at stake, right? I mean, with a win, you have a chance to really put the nation on watch. But with the loss, it's not the end of the world because technically you're supposed to lose this game. Like it would suck. It would suck a lot. But it's not the end of the world. You just have to bounce back and make sure you handle business for the rest of the season. Let's go to ACC play over the weekend. It's safe to say that this was not a good week for the conference. Now, teams like Miami, Louisville, and Clemson won, as they should have. But you look across the board. North Carolina scored 50 points against James Madison. The only unfortunate part is they allowed 70 to James Madison. They lost by 20 points despite scoring 50. Doesn't help the ACC. Virginia Tech hosted Rutgers. Lost 26-23. Doesn't hurt their conference play, but Virginia Tech's 2-2 now. Pittsburgh, Duke, and Virginia handle business. SMU demolished TCU 66-42. Boston College won 23-19. Florida State won 14-9. Stanford beat Syracuse on the road. It just wasn't an overall pretty showing, with North Carolina losing, Virginia Tech losing, NC State getting blown out. Going on. So I guess it could have been worse. But it wasn't really a great week for the conference, because those out-of-conference games you look at and you're like, come on, man, just win those games. Biggest riser, biggest faller. There's a couple of risers. I went with a couple of different options here. I'm going to say Stanford, just because of where they were. Like Clemson, it's hard to go up from where you're at in Tier 2. Boston College, sort of the same way in Tier 3. But Stanford was able to go on the road to beat Syracuse and give Syracuse their first loss of the season. Syracuse beat Georgia Tech in their second game before the bye, and then they end up losing to Stanford. Shout out to the Cardinal for overcoming an early, or I'm sorry, not an early deficit, but a late game deficit, to where they had to come back to win the game. They were able to really take advantage. Alec Eilmanor is one of the best receivers in the conference. He put that on full display on Friday night, and the Stanford Cardinal got the victory over Syracuse. So two things are true. Number one, or two things can be true, but we need to find out: is Stanford better than we thought, or is Syracuse a little bit more overrated? Syracuse did beat Georgia Tech. If you're going to go down the rabbit hole of saying, well, this team beat that team but lost to this team, but beat that team but lost to this team, you're going to drive yourself crazy, literally in any setting, literally in any sport. So you have to just sort of be aware that anything can happen on any given week. It felt like Syracuse really didn't do a good job of moving the ball in this first half, to the point to where you gave Stanford the opportunity to just sort of set the tone. Kyle McCord wasn't as efficient. He had 2 interceptions. Syracuse wasn't able to run the football. So Stanford, despite some of their mistakes, they were able to overcome those. The two, it was tied for the biggest faller. 1A, 1B. It starts with North Carolina. I know you lost your quarterback, Max Johnson, in the season opener for the entirety of the 2024 campaign. But you scored 50 points against James Madison and lost by 20. You gave up 70 points and lost by 20. And look, James Madison might be better than people think, but they're not scored. They shouldn't be scored 70 points in Chapel Hill better. That's, I don't know what to say. That's bad. That is a very bad loss. And maybe they're not as bad as we think, but giving up 70 points is bad. The other biggest faller is NC State. Look, I know that they started a true freshman quarterback in Bailey. Bailey didn't have a terrible game. He had 204 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Raphael was really good in the backfield for NC State. But Clemson's offense did whatever. And they were pretty much in cruise control for the entirety of this game. Like, NC State scored 28 in the second half, 21 in the fourth quarter, when the game was pretty much over. Like, NC State's defense was Swiss cheese against Clemson's offense. Like, if you were looking for the Wolfpack defense to show you anything, it was to show you that they might be in trouble. They are the biggest fallers here. I told you that they were on fraud watch, that this week was going to be a telltale sign, and unfortunately, I can't keep vouching for them. I think that the reality is that NC State, at this point in time, is just not a good football team. It's sad to say, from an ACC standpoint, not from Louisville standpoint, but from an ACC standpoint. So it just sort of is what it is. The Cardinals are in a 5-way tie for the conference lead with Boston College, Virginia, Clemson, and Stanford. Syracuse is 1-1. Georgia Tech and Florida State 1-2. Cal, NC State, and Wake Forest 0-1, and then you have a plethora of teams: Duke, Miami, Pittsburgh, UNC, SMU, and Virginia Tech that have yet to play a conference game. So a lot of still a lot of parity across the entirety of the ACC. It's just too hard to tell at the moment. And this week's games really aren't all that inspiring either. Like maybe they are from a conference standing point of view, but from an overall like, ooh, that's going to be a really good game. There's not really many of those at the moment. Like Louisville, Notre Dame, by far is the number one ACC game to watch for this weekend because look, you're factoring in two ranked teams. Louisville is supposed to be one of your better teams that you have, and they're going on the road and playing a Notre Dame team. Now, I know that Notre Dame is independent, so this isn't going to have any conference implications in terms of ACC records, but it will maybe give us a glimpse on, okay, how, excuse me, sitting here yawning talking about the rest of the ACC. That's not a good sign, y'all. I'm sitting here yawning halfway in of around the ACC. This will give you more of a glimpse as to how close to Miami is Louisville. You know, you're still trying to figure out how legit are the Clemson Tigers, how legit are the Miami Hurricanes, how legit are the Louisville Cardinals. This is a great opportunity to get a glimpse into, well, one of the teams in that sequence. Two other games to watch for. They are two conference games, true conference games. The first one is UNC at Duke. It's a 4 o'clock kickoff down in Durham. Both teams have not played a conference game. I know that both teams probably aren't the greatest teams in the ACC, but Duke is 4-0 under Manny Diaz currently. They have beaten Elon, Northwestern, UConn, Middle Tennessee State. UConn and Northwestern weren't really convincing wins, but they were wins. So I think that this is just mainly one of the games to watch for because the rest of the conference slate, let's face it, y'all, it's just not that great. Virginia Tech is at Miami. That, spoiler alert, that game is also on this. But the three other games to watch outside of the Louisville game, one of them is North Carolina Duke, just because both of them have not played a conference game, and one of them will have a loss come this time next week. Florida State and SMU is one of the other conference games that I'm looking at. Florida State is going to an SMU team that didn't really have a great start to the season, but they've sort of picked it up. Their one loss is to BYU, who very well could be ranked. They beat TCU 66-42. So I want to see, number one, if Florida State can start the trend back upward with a road win here. Their win against Cal was not it wasn't impressive to say the least, but it was a win. So will they be able to go to another new ACC member and get a win? Or can SMU just sort of continually build up their resume, because they do play Louisville next week? So this is a game to watch for basically by default because they do play the Cardinals next week. So just a heads up there. And then the number one game to watch for is the one that I just mentioned. It is a Friday night game. Virginia Tech at number 7 Miami, 7:30 kickoff at Hard Rock Stadium. I think that Miami wins this game. I do. I think it's Miami minus 17, so they're expected to win this game by a lot. But a lot of this is centered around Virginia Tech. Like, Virginia Tech is also in the same boat that NC State is in. Like, I can only vouch for a team so much before they just are who they are. Like, I'm trying to, let teams sort of build themselves back up before the verdict is finally given. But NC State, fraud alert. Virginia Tech, they just lost to Rutgers. They lost to Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt took Missouri down to overtime, so maybe that Vanderbilt loss doesn't look too awful, but you lost to Rutgers as well. If you get blown out to Miami, we got to have the NC State conversation, y'all. So that's the main thing here is there's 3 inter-ACC games that will give us a little bit more clarification on the standings. We get to see Duke, SMU, and Virginia Tech. I think all 3 of those teams are the games or are the opponents that we have to really kind of zone in on and watch if you are trying to get a pulse of what is happening in the ACC. This is going to be a little bit shorter of an episode. Like I said, I'm on some time constraints, but I did want to jump on here and give a little bit of preview for what's at stake against Notre Dame, sort of talk about what the benefit was to winning that Georgia Tech game, the biggest risers and biggest fallers, the 3 games to watch for, and much, much more. But one of the main things I do want to talk about before we get out of here is that I think that a lot of people overlooked Clemson. Like, I do think that this Clemson team, I'll be honest, could be as good as Miami. Like, Miami beat South Florida. Yes, they beat Ball State, Florida A&M, and Florida, but I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying great competition. I think Clemson is closer to Miami than people think. Like, yes, they got beat to Georgia. Everyone gets beat to Georgia, but they beat Appalachian State pretty handedly. They beat NC State by a lot. Clemson is going to have to continue to prove themselves. You're not going to get much. They do play Stanford this week, so you imagine that they're going to play well there. The issue is you're not going to get like a resounding matchup for the Tigers before they play against Louisville. Like, they have Stanford, Florida State, Wake Forest, and Virginia before they play the Cardinals in early November. So it's like, even with wins, like, how much can you realistically say, like, with confidence that this is a really good Clemson team? I think Clemson's a good team. They have a massive defense. And if Cade Klubnik is able to be serviceable at quarterback for Dabo Swinney's offense, they have a chance to be really, really good. So, like I said, very impromptu episode of Around the ACC with DP. A couple things that will hopefully be coming up on the next episode of the show, which will air next week. A new overlay for the show. You're not going to see the Live with 55 graphic. I don't know about the intro. We're going to sort of test some things out with the intro video. If not, I'll just continually use the CSC podcast intro. And there will be a new guest when we come back on episode 3 of Around the ACC with DP. Thanks again for tuning in, you all. And most importantly, go Cards. Let's beat Notre Dame.